Hello everyone. Welcome to GDG Meetup. My name is Tushar Pal, and I guess you guys will be like so excited for the Angular talks. So definitely, yeah. So we have Minko with us, and just to brief about the Minko is the part of Angular team at the Google, and he's like really a good speaker, and he's like really well. So yeah, so personally, I would say I will be also excited for listening him, and he will be delivering the session on state of Angular SSR and pre-rendering and deployment. Yeah, so hope to like listen about the same. Hi, Mingo.
Hello. Yeah, let me share my screen so we can get started.
Sure.
All right. I hope you see my screen now.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting today. This is the closest that I have been in India so far, so I'm pretty excited to be sharing this content with you. So my name is Minko Gechev. I'm an engineer at the Angular team at Google, where I'm focused on different things. I'm working on standardization of keeping us in touch with the standardization committees, working on performance. Recently, I've been focused on deployment, server-side rendering and pre-rendering, development tooling, and things like that. A lot of fun things like that. So today, I'm really excited to share with you the state of the Angular's deployment, server-side rendering, and pre-rendering. We're going to discuss pretty much what new features we introduced in Angular Universal recently, and how we collaborated with Firebase to make server-side SSR deployments more intuitive. So I'm going to share the story into the context of my personal story on how I got introduced to web development. And at the same time, we're also going to follow the development of the different rendering strategies in web over time. We're going to go back to 1991, when the first website ever was deployed to the World Wide Web. Back then, web pages were just simple text documents, just a bunch of markup that web servers were delivering to the user browser. The user browser was parsing this markup and eventually rendering some content. But this was still a very fascinating architecture, where we had different hyperlinks that were connecting many different, like hundreds or thousands and millions of different resources together. And this was pretty fascinating, and it was serving its purpose for quite some time. But at the same time, the business had slightly higher requirements. These documents were static, so we weren't able to accept any input from the user and store it to a database, let's say. And at the same time, we weren't able to generate them dynamically by taking some content from a database. So that is why different engineers came up with the idea for CGI. That is the Common Gateway Interface. That was pretty much used to take an external program and pass the user request as an input from the web server, so that this external program is able to process the user requests, eventually take some data from somewhere, and generate a dynamic page. So here is, with the sequence diagram, how things looked like. The user was sending a request to the web server, and the web server was forwarding through the Common Gateway Interface this request, so that the CGI program, written in any language you want, was able to fetch some data from a database, let's say, and automatically just generate dynamically the contents that the user was supposed to see. Now, at this point, you can see that I have this LCP marker here. This LCP stands for the largest contentful paint. The largest contentful paint is a user-centric metric that estimates when the page is useful for the user. So notice that it says useful for the user. This doesn't mean interactive. We are not talking about JavaScript here. This means that just we're providing some content to the user so that they can engage with our web app. This could be just some images or a bunch of text that the user can start reading at this point. That was decent for quite some time, and people were satisfied with the requirements. People were satisfied with what they were getting from the web. But at a certain point, the business requirements were still higher. Like, we weren't able to achieve desktop-like user experience by sending requests one after another to a web server and getting dynamically generated pages and having browser reloads. Imagine we have a very complicated web app with a tiny form which allows us to edit only one of the fields for a user, let's say. Each such action for editing a very tiny piece of data was requiring an entire page reload. And on slow connection, especially over HTTP 1.1, this wasn't providing a very satisfying desktop-like user experience. So that is why, with the evolution of web standards, different folks came up with the idea of AJAX. AJAX is nothing more than just a bunch of different techniques that are using web APIs, which allow us to perform more incremental page loads asynchronously. So we are able to just asynchronously reload only small portion of the page without having to reload the entire web app. So here is what I'm talking about. Now, the user is still sending a request to the web server, and the web server is delegating the execution for the page generation to a external program through CGI, let's say. This was actually mostly commonly in the past when Ajax became popular. This was mostly the LAMP stack, the Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So in this particular case, the user was sending requests to an Apache server, which was delegating the request to a PHP script that was fetching some data from a database, from MySQL, let's say, and right after that, returning this generated content to the browser. At this point, the browser is parsing the content and figuring out that there are some scripts, some JavaScripts, that are aiming to add some dynamic behavior to the page. The browser was sending a bunch of different requests to fetch these scripts, and from there on, we were adding interactivity to our web app. This interactivity here, I'm referring to it as TTI, time to interactive. Later on, by using Ajax, with these scripts that we attach to the page, we're able to fetch data from, again, our PHP backend by directly sending a post or a GET requests. That was around the time when I got introduced for the first time to web development. In fact, this was my high school teacher who shared this book with me, Development of Projects for the Web with PHP and MySQL. That was a pretty heavy read, and that's the authentic cover, actually. That's the Bulgarian cover of the book. I'm originally from Bulgaria, so I read the book in Bulgarian. Like, I can't tell you how confusing some of the technical terms were translated to Bulgarian. But anyhow, I ended up developing this web application. That's one of my first websites. So it's a web app developed with PHP, with MySQL database, and a lot of JavaScript. That was, in fact, a CMS system, content management system, which I used to build this particular website, mountains.skull.org. That was for the local mountain chain that we have in the city where I was born. I ended up also presenting my website in front of a national jury. You can see here that I'm sharing my presentation with these two people, and they were looking at me like pretty strictly. Anyhow, this ended up pretty good. I went to university thanks to this work. And around these years, around 2009, 2010, there was this constant evolution of the web, and things were slowly moving from the back end, from these CGI scripts, to the front end. People started like putting more structure to JavaScript instead of just throwing different source files on the page, and this ended up to the development of Angular JS and Backbone. These were two of the most popular initial JavaScript frameworks that put some structure into the development of single-page applications. The way we started rendering web applications also changed a lot because of these frameworks. Now, instead of rendering the content onto the server through CGI scripts, we approached things slightly differently. Here you can see that we have, again, our browser. It is sending a request to a web server. But this time, the web server is not forwarding any request to a CGI script. It is just returning a static HTML page, which has a bunch of scripts, a bunch of JavaScripts. Later on, we start downloading these JavaScripts one by one and executing them. And notice that to this point, the user still sees nothing. There was originally a blank page right after that loading indicator. And finally, once we execute all the JavaScript files associated with this page, the user is finally able to see something onto the screen in the form of the largest contentful panes. And finally, the page is also interactive. From this point on, the page is like super interactive. It provides desktop-like user experience. We're able to make incremental page reloads. We're able to fetch data synchronously and have very smooth transition across pages. But still, there is a lot of waiting. Imagine having a slow dial-up connection back then. Imagine trying to open a web app that has 2 megabytes of JavaScript without any rendering on the server. The user is going to see all these loading indicators for tens of seconds or even minutes, and eventually they can give up and directly leave our web app. The only thing that developers were able to do, and still are able to do in order to speed up the user experience with client-side rendering, is just to reduce the size of the scripts that they're sending to the user, right? Well, this is, to a huge extent, responsibility of framework developers like us on the Angular team. So we're constantly trying to shrink the bundles of the web applications that you're building with Angular. We're applying different techniques. We're applying more efficient code generation by, for example, with Ivy. We're generating we're shrinking your bundles even further now by generating more compact instructions. We're applying techniques for efficient tree shaking so that you can get rid of the framework, the piece of the framework that you're not using. We're even investigating on how your scripts are going to compress better with gzip or broadly if we're generating instructions in different formats. So at certain points around Angular version 4, actually, we had this joke that with the rate of speed that we're decreasing the bundles of user applications, we're eventually going to make them negative. So you're going to kind of gain bandwidth just by building web applications with Angular. Like, obviously, this is not possible. There is still a long way for us to go in order to improve the bundle size of Angular applications to be as good as we want it to be. But, well, at certain point, you still need to deliver some scripts to the user, right? You still need to make your application interactive and give the user the opportunity to have some functionality to actually use your application, right? So at certain points, the bundles of your app just can't get any smaller. I put this insanely insightful quote here by myself that at certain point, you should just deliver some JavaScript to the user. And the more rich your application is, the larger your bundles are going to be as well. To this realization reached like many more people in the past, even decade, I would say. So that is why with the evolution of the web, we also get the opportunity to build server-side experiences by using JavaScript. We were able to run JavaScript on the server by using Node.js. Around that time, people started experimenting running their client-side applications onto the server. They were just pretending that your Node.js application server was a browser, passing some like fake implementation of the DOM, and from there on, relying on your front-end framework to render the page the same way that it is going to render it in the browser. Here is how things look like. So the user is sending a request to the application server that is running Node.js. The Node.js server pretends that it is a browser using some fake DOM implementation and generating just a bunch of markup that represents what the client was going to generate in the browser. And from there on, we're getting an interactive content once we load all the scripts. But even before that, the users is already ready for engagement. By server-side rendering our application, we're getting the exact same behavior that we were getting with CGI like many years ago. But this time, we're getting also the advantage that we are reusing all the source code for client-side rendering and server-side rendering together. So we don't have to, like, we have complete code sharing. We don't have to write the same source code into different languages, for instance. So this was very trending around 2012, 2013, I would say. 2014, I gave my very first international talk. I was back then based in Bulgaria, and I flew all the way to Las Vegas, Nevada. That was an extremely memorable moment for me. Like, after I gave this talk in front of these people that you can see here on the slides, I was so nervous that I just went to my room and I locked myself there and stayed in my room for the next 6 hours or so. Anyway, on this event, I not only presented my research on how we can use immutable data structures with AngularJS, but I also met a few fantastic folks. There, I got introduced to Patrick. And later on, together with Jeff, in 2014 on Angular U, they presented the very first version of Angular Universal, which is the server-side rendering solution for Angular. Since then, we combined forces. Since then, Angular Universal now is a project which is a joint collaboration between community and the Angular team, and we're moving it together. Now it is a robust industrial solution that is used by hundreds or probably tens of thousands of companies worldwide, including large companies that are handling a lot of traffic, such as Crunchbase. However, talking to developers over time, I noticed that people are facing two common challenges with Universal in their development flow. The first is change refresh time, and the second, deployment. By change refresh time, I mean the period between changing a file in your project and right after that previewing the changes in the browser. Prior to version 9, you had to pretty much make a change and right after that compile manually your client, your server, and right after that run your Angular Universal development server in order to preview the changes in the browser. Now with version 9, we introduce a new builder for the Angular CLI, which is just a new functionality as part of the Angular Universal Express and Happy engines. So all you need to do when you want to run your Angular Universal project in development is just ng run the name of your project serve SSR, and that's all. From here, we're going to start watching your file system, and when you make a change, we're going to compile both your client and your server and refresh your browser once the compilation completes. So this is not a complete replacement of ng-serve, because we're doing more work here. We need to compile both the client and the server, so your experience is going to be slower. But still, when you're making changes that impact both your client and your server, this is a pretty decent and convenient command to use. To take advantage of it, if you're already using Angular Universal, you make sure that you update to the latest version of Angular Universal Happy or Express engine. So this is another example of collaboration between the Angular team and community. Alan from the Angular CLI team worked together with Manfred, and well, they came up with this and made it available for everyone. The next thing that I want to talk about is deployment. So deployment hasn't been really too hard for Angular Universal. People are usually using different on-compute engines, such as Cloud Functions, Firebase Functions, or something in between these lines, for instance, Cloud Run. These are all great solutions, and there are really well-defined guides in the internet where you can find how to take your Angular application and from development, move to production, and push your application into the cloud. But they still involved quite a few manual steps, and they weren't providing really the experience that we were hoping to deliver to our users. That is why, as part of version 6 of Angular Fire, we combined forces in another joint collaboration, this time with the Firebase team, and shipped ng-deploy for applications with enabled server-side rendering. In order to deploy your Angular application to a Firebase function, all you need to do is just run ng-add Angular/Fire. Right after that, we're going to install a couple of dependencies in your project. And if you have an Angular Universal project, we're going to detect that and offer to deploy it as a Firebase function. Here, if you agree, we're just going to install a couple of more dependencies which are required for us to allow you to preview the Firebase function, for instance. We're going to fetch all your projects from Firebase and allow you to select one where you can directly deploy your application by running ng-deploy. Once you run those commands, we're going to compile your project with the best production configuration possible. And from there on, we're going to deploy all your static assets to Firebase hosting. And we're going to push your backend or your server as a Firebase function. So when you click on this URL that we provide to you, you're going to be able to directly preview the result in the browser. And notice that this is a server-side render tab. So, well, everything we needed to do here is just two commands: ng-add, Angular/Fire, and ng-deploy. When deploying an Angular Universal application, it doesn't matter whether we're deploying it to the cloud on an on-demand compute engine like Cloud Run, or if we do that on-prem solution, there are some redundancies that usually happen. Now, imagine you have user A. User A opens a specific URL in your web app. This is going to trigger a request to your Firebase function. Your Firebase function is going to server-side render this particular path, this particular URL, and it is going to return it to the client. Now, user B goes and opens the same page. This is going to trigger another Firebase function request. We're going to run server-side rendering for the exact same page, and we're going to return the exact same content. Imagine we have hundreds of thousands or millions of users opening the exact same page. This means that we're doing a lot of redundant work without actually doing anything too much useful. A lot of people are solving this problem by introducing a caching layer. But just like with regular expressions, with caches, when you introduce a cache to solve a problem, now you have two problems. Now you need to think about cache invalidation, you need to think about the keys that you're going to use for caching, and so on and so forth. But still, this works. The user is sending a request. We're first checking whether there is an associated response in the cache. And if there is one, we're going to directly return it to the client. Alternatively, we're going to forward the request to our Firebase function. We're going to render the content there and return it to the caching layer so that we can associate this particular request with the response that we just rendered. Although this works, as I mentioned, we're introducing redundant complexity, and we can do better. Since these pages, they don't change that frequently, we can render them as part of the build process. So now, instead of using universal and server-side rendering on the server, we're going to use it as part of the build process with pre-rendering. So pre-rendering is a technique that allows us to run Angular Universal as part of your build process. When you run ng-build, we'll be pretty much able to generate all the different routes in your applications which don't have any dynamic parameters as part of the build time. To take advantage of this feature, you should just run ng-run the name of your project, :pre-render. And this is another new feature as part of Angular version 9. And in particular, ng Universal Express Engine and Happy Engine version 9. Once you run this command, we're going to first build both your client and your server. And right after that, we're going to pre-render all the pages without any parameters, or with all the pages that you have specified to be rendered. So we spent some time optimizing the experience, and now we're able to render about 800 pages for less than 2 seconds. Some folks from community, Steve, he experimented with a larger project which has 10,000 pages, and the entire build process took about 75 seconds. And I'm sure that in pre-rendering were spent probably around 15 to 20 seconds. The remaining 50 seconds, were probably spent in just building the client and the server. So having this pre-rendering experience, we're an even better citizen of the so-called Jamstack. The Jamstack comes from JavaScript, APIs, and markup. This is a new paradigm for building web applications, which makes it simpler. You don't really have to think about complicated deployment and the server server at all, because you have APIs from different services, and you're just deploying static assets in the form of pre-rendered pages to a CDN. There is also a community project called Scully, which is developed by Hero Devs. It takes slightly different pre-rendering approach, but it is a full-fledged website, static site generator that allows to fetch data from a variety of different sources. So I don't know if you notice how many times I said collaborating in this presentation, but well, we collaborated on Universal, we collaborated on Scully, we're collaborating on deployment, pre-rendering, and so on and so forth. I'm really excited to be part of this open source community where we can move things forward together just by collaborating, no matter where we are in the world. Thank you very much for your attention. I would love to get your thoughts about this presentation at this short link here, mgv.io/talk. Thank you, and I would love to answer your questions. If you have any questions, I guess you can ask them in the live chat.
So first question, I guess, is best website for deploying your apps.
There are different services. So obviously Firebase is an option. You can also use Netlify. You can use Zeit, or they actually changed their name recently. They're called something else. They're called Vercel. I usually prefer Firebase because they have pretty large free quota, so I can deploy a lot of different web applications until I have to pay for it. And I can deploy both static websites and also applications with server-side rendering. So that's pretty convenient alternative.
Okay. And another question is from Hitesh. He's saying, does using Universal helps in SEO optimization?
So most search engines right now, they're able to even run your JavaScript so they can perform kind of client-side rendering. But still, Universal helps with improving your user-centric metrics, and search engines are looking for this. They would want to prioritize the content which is the most responsive and which is delivered to the user as fast as possible, and Universal is going to definitely help with this. It also helps with social media content. You're able to see the pre-rendered both image and short description of the page when you're using Universal, and with much more.
Okay. So another question is from the Yogesh. What is the difference between Angular and Angular Universal?
So Angular is the framework that you're using for building web applications. And these web applications, they can be rendered in the browser. So once you load the application, Angular can discover the root, the host element of the app, and from there on, it can render all the entire DOM structure of the application right in the browser. An alternative is to, instead of rendering this in the browser, to render it on the server. So this is just another module. Angular Universal is a module which allows you to render your Angular applications on the server. You can think of Angular as the entire platform for development of web applications, and Angular Universal is just a subset of this platform, which allows to perform server-side rendering. Okay. I hope this is a little bit more clear. If it's not, feel free to reach out.
Another question is, are there any courses regarding this topic?
Yeah, I'm sure there are courses in Pluralsight for sure, but we also have Angular Universal guides, I believe so, on Angular.io. So you can find this guide. I'm going to share it in the chat as well. I share it in YouTube. So it's Angular.io/guide/universal.
Okay. And another question is, how to convert Angular project to Angular Universal?
So if you have a running Angular application, the chances are that you will be able to use server-side rendering as well. There might be some incompatibilities. For example, right now in Angular Universal, you cannot access some APIs that are only available in the browser. For instance, if you try to touch local storage directly, I believe this is going to throw you an error, and it is going to throw you a pretty obvious error. It's going to tell you, well, there is no object local storage available here. So in this case, on the server, it usually doesn't really make too much sense to access local storage. In this case, you can just conditionally run this logic. And only if you're running in the browser, you can access local storage. Alternatively, you can just do nothing, no operation.
Okay. Another question is, can you explain difference between ng-serve and ng-run?
Yeah, so we introduced these Angular CLI builders, and these Angular CLI builders, they can be all run by using ng-run, the name of your project, and the name of the builder. For some builders, which are very common, you would want very frequently to use, such as running your development server, we have shortcuts. ng-serve is such shortcut. Alternatively, you should be able to run ng-run, the name of your project, :serve, I believe. And this is going to be pretty much equivalent of ng-serve. So ng-serve is just a short alias.
Okay. Another question is from Tarang. Can we then not use SSR pre-rendering if Angular app uses dynamic import or dynamic component?
So it depends how you're using this dynamic import. In general, you should be able to use pre-rendering as soon as your application is compatible. So if you have dynamic imports of modules and you have lazily loaded modules, you should be able to use pre-rendering as well. We will be able to resolve the module the same, like this lazy module in the server environment as well.
Okay. Next question is from Sachin. Does Angular CLI has any command to convert Angular to Angular Universal like ng update?
Yeah. So all you need to do in order to make your Angular application with enable server-side rendering is run ng at. Well, let me actually type the command in the chat because it's going to be simpler. Okay, I sent it. ng at ng-universal/express engine.
Okay. And another question from Udyot. Suppose we are dealing with large amount of data in a backend. So which one is the best to use? Angular LVY or Angular Universal?
Yeah, so Angular Ivy is a so Angular Ivy this is a project that we use the name Ivy for both our compiler and rendering pipeline. So our rendering in general with Ivy, it is platform independent. So Ivy you can use for client-side rendering and for server-side rendering. You can use it for both. So my suggestion would be to use Angular Universal with Ivy. Ivy and Universal are not orthogonal concepts. They're pretty much very overlapping ones.
Okay. So we are done with the question. So guys, any question do you have still? We are still open for 2 minutes.
I see two more. There is a does Angular Universal puts more load on the server side? Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the Angular Universal can definitely. So if you're using client-side rendering, the entire rendering is happening only on the client. So you have this distributed architecture where every client is taking the load for what they request. They're rendering their content in the browser. And you're delivering the content from a CDN, from a content delivery network, where the CDN is just giving a bunch of static content to the browser. It doesn't do anything complicated. When you're using Universal, however, you need to run your Angular application on the server, so this definitely makes it more expensive. And that is why it makes sense for you to use pre-rendering if you can, or put a caching layer.
Okay.
There is one more. Any seed project available to quick start with Angular Universal? I would recommend you to use the Angular CLI.
There is another one.
Yeah. So yeah, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So are we going back to old school model like CGI where we deliver full content from server instead of processing in client side? What is the benefit of it, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we are pretty much server-side rendering in a similar way that we used to with CGI, with the difference now that we are sharing the content, that the logic that we're using for server-side rendering and client-side rendering. This is the largest benefit that I see. But that's true. We made a full circle.
Another question is, does Angular pre-rendering support the pre-rendering of 3D animation like 3JS?
Yeah, 3GS, I believe, is going to render things on a canvas. So on the client, you're just going to get the canvas, but it can, like, theoretically it can render it as an image, and yeah, theoretically it's possible. Out of the box, probably it's not going to work. Out of the box, you're probably going to get just a canvas on the client, and it's going to be empty. But if you add some custom logic, you will be able to render. Well, it's going to be a complicated project. My guess is that you'd have to use some server-side implementation, some Node.js implementation of the canvas, like Node Canvas or something, in order to pass this to 3GS. And here we have the question whether 3GS can use this canvas implementation out of the box. From there on, you can export the result as an image and just place it in the server-side rendered content. This would be a workaround that I can think of. So it's possible, but my guess is that it's not going to work out of the box.
Another question is from Sachin. Can we implement SEO in Angular without Angular Universals?
Yeah, Angular IO actually doesn't use Angular Universal at all, and it's doing pretty well with the SEO. So it's not a strict requirement, but it is definitely going to help your ranking.
Will command of Angular version add work with version 9?
Yeah, everything is backwards compatible. When you see a new version of Angular, this doesn't mean that you have to learn things from scratch. This just means that we made some significant improvements, and there might be some very minor changes that you're probably not going to notice.
Okay. Does Angular Universal support partial view, or we are still need to create a whole new component?
I'm not sure what exactly you mean here by partial view in this context. If you can give more details, this would be great.
Which is the better deployment on Heroku, AWS, or Firebase? It's
Yeah, it depends on your preference. I'm not too familiar with Heroku. I've been using mostly AWS and Firebase. My guess is that everything you can do with Firebase, you can do it AWS, and everything you can do with AWS, you can do with the entire like Google Cloud platform. And it's mostly a matter of personal preference. My preference would be GCP, I guess, but I'm also a little bit biased since I'm working at Google. So keep that in mind.
yeah. Does Angular Universal puts more loads on server side as millions
Yeah.
of clients would be get connected to it?
Yeah, that's why I'm recommending you to use pre-rendering when possible. This way, you're going to render the content only once as part of your build process. And from there on, it will be very simple for you to deploy this to a static CDN and get the rendered content for free.
Can Angular Universal be used on the server like Azure? What other servers are supported and will be supported?
Yeah, Angular Universal can be used there as well. You can use Angular Universal with pretty much any cloud platform, including your on-prem solution. If you want to host it yourself, you can do that. Just one comment. The integration that we have with the Angular CLI right now, this is something that we collaborated closely with the Firebase team. So deployment to Azure may not look that like ergonomic. It might not be as simple as deployment to Firebase. This is mostly because Firebase are very close. Like I'm on the 5th floor, and James that I'm working with, he's on the 4th floor in the office building. So it's really easy to work together. We collaborated with Microsoft as well on deployments to Azure, but it doesn't include server-side rendering so far. If you're interested, I'm sure they're going to look at it, and they're going to implement it for you if there is enough interest.
So another question from Praveen, how to improve time to first byte while using SSR?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I guess you should look for proximity. So you can have you can have servers in different regions. And also you should make sure that you should do a lot of profiling of your application just to make sure that you're not getting stuck in certain lifecycle hooks, which definitely don't make sense for the server. So these are things to take advantage of. And you can also look at some latency based routing. For example, if you have servers in different regions, you would want to send the user to the closest server to their physical location so that you can minimize the wait time, the latency, and at the same time make sure that your application is rendering as optimally as possible. These are some high-level suggestions. I'm sure that for a specific use case, we'll be able to dig even deeper.
Okay. Another question from Gaurav. Is Angular Universal is the only option for web crawling using Facebook Open Graph and Twitter cards?
I think, so it depends how dynamic your Twitter cards, it depends how dynamic you want them to be. If you have only a single card, then you may not even need Angular Universal. But if you have a series of blog posts, let's say, and you would want to have a unique card for each one of them, you should use Angular Universal, either server-side rendering or with pre-rendering.
Next question from Ashutosh. How has been your experience working with Google so far? It's, I guess, not non-technical question.
Yeah, it's very dynamic. I love it, and it's really, really dynamic. Originally, I thought it's going to be A little bit slower because it's a large company. It has like 100,000 employees or so. So I thought it's going to be moving slow, but it's much more dynamic even than the startup that I co-founded before that. So it's really dynamic.
Yeah. So next question with Damandeep. How pre-rendering works while using lazy loading?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I haven't implemented this feature actually myself, but my guess is that we're just going to read. We're going to transform the dynamic imports to file reads, and from there we're going to load the lazy loaded modules and execute them in the same way that we're going to execute them on the client. And from there, we're just going to transform the static pages, the rendered content to static pages on the disk. So it's a small piece of logic that is actually different. If you look at it, like we're just transforming dynamic imports, which are sending network requests, we're transforming them to file reads, which are again asynchronous operations that are just reading a bunch of files from the disk asynchronously. So they have the same interface. So it's not impossible to do.
Okay, so I guess we are done with all the questions, and guys, you will be having like all the question answers. So, like, uh, I would like to thanks Minku for like presenting here and like giving time to us for the community, and it is like really a great opportunity for us to also learn more about the Angular Universal and pre-rendering and also the other parts as well, because that is also like the new things for us as well. So we would like to have a Minko on the next in the future meetups as well. So that would be like the great opportunity for us to like learn more about the Angular part and how the thing is going and how Angular is far away, like the things in terms of technology. So uh, thank you so much, Minko,
Thank you very
and
much for having me. It was a pleasure.
thank you guys for coming. And definitely we will be coming with more meetups related to Angular and other topics as well. Thank you guys, and you can ask any of question. You can connect to Minku on the Twitter. He's like really so active person, so you can ask him on the Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can connect him.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you online.
Thank you. Bye bye.